We're here today to celebrate the release of How We Go Home, Voices from Indigenous North America. And this is with our new partners, which we're so happy to partner with, Voice of Witness, and published by Haymarket Books. We want to welcome you here to the unceded land of the Ohlone tribal people and acknowledge the many Ramaytush Ohlone tribal groups and families as the rightful stewards on the lands on which we reside and work here in the Bay Area. SFPL encourages you to learn more about first-person culture, land rights, and we're committed to hosting events like this, not just in November, but all year long. And the link that I put in the chat has lots of great resources to Indigenous culture, lots of reading lists and resource lists. Go ahead and feel free to put in the chat what land you are residing on today, and I'll also put a link to a site called Native Lands in just a moment. San Francisco Public Library also wants to acknowledge that we're not a neutral institution and stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Movement and ending systemic, structural, and institutional racism in our own house and in our own community. As a library, we're here to provide factual and useful information about the Black Lives Movement and being an anti-racist. So same document will have lots of resources about that as well. I have some quick library announcements. We will be having a book club on How We Go Home happening December 14th, 7 p.m., a Monday book club. Those are always nice. So get your book now, and you can get this from Haymarket, and I will put the link in the chat box in just a moment. We are celebrating Elaine Castillo's America's Not the Heart as our bi-monthly read. Pick it up at your library to go. And we are finally celebrating our One City, One Book, which we called an annual, but the shelter in place has shifted things mildly in this area, lots of ways, other areas. But Chanel Miller, amazing book, amazing author, amazing woman. Please pick up the book, check it out at one of our 8 Library to Go locations, or you can purchase it from the Friends of the Library store or your favorite bookstore. Support our local bookstores. Library to Go, like I said, you can get all your books and films and all of that at one of those 8 locations. 3 of those are mobile locations too. And love to all my family out there working, my library family working in the Library to Go locations and mobile locations and locations like disaster service work, food banks, contact tracers. Please mask up when you go out and protect my library family and all of our families out there working. So important, and we know what's happening. So celebrate at home with us. The library has tons to offer for you. Free movies, free films, all of these amazing events. You can catch up on YouTube. We have all the events there. Tomorrow, you can join me twice. I have 2 programs tomorrow, but I'm so excited about this one. This is a lovely family that has been activists since before Alcatraz, and then they joined the Alcatraz movement and the occupation, and they're going to come tell us their stories of their family in activism. So please, 11 a.m. tomorrow, register. You can also find it on YouTube. So today, again, I am so excited to have our new partners, Voice of Witness, and I'm going to introduce you to Ella Banerjee, who is going to lead and intro today's panel. How We Go Home is the latest addition to Voice of Witness book series, and we are excited to have this storytelling and narrators here with us today. It's quite an honor. So I'm going to turn it over now to Ella Banerjee from Voice of Witness.
Thanks so much, Anissa, and want to give a big thanks to the San Francisco Public Library for hosting us today. It's really exciting to be in this virtual space, and want to say thank you to everyone who's joining us now in Zoom and on YouTube. We're really excited that you're here for this conversation. Again, this event is celebrating the launch of How We Go Home, Voices from Indigenous North America. My name is Ella Banerjee. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Community Partnership Coordinator at the nonprofit Voice of Witness. I want to thank Anissa for doing a land acknowledgement about where the library is from. If we were all gathered in one physical space, we would recognize and thank those whose land we're all on. But since we're all distant, I'm going to ask the speakers to share where they are on, whose land they are on. I'm calling from Ohlone land, also known as Berkeley. Sara, would you like to share where you're calling from?
Sure. I'm calling from Lenape land, Fort Greene, Brooklyn.
Thank you. Ashley, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm calling from Fort Mojave Tribal Homelands in Fort Mojave, California, also known as Needles. And we're in 3 states, California, Arizona, and Nevada.
Thanks, Ashley. And Terria, would you like to go next?
Yes, I am calling from Mountain Cahuilla territory. I'm a desert Cahuilla, but I'm in Mountain Cahuilla territory today.
Thank you all for sharing that. And again, as Anissa mentioned, we really encourage folks who are tuning in to share whose ancestral lands you're calling from. If you don't know, you can find more information from that website, which is native-land.ca. So I encourage you to visit that if you don't know whose land you're on. And so, as we mentioned earlier, today's event is based around the launch of this new book, How We Go Home, Voices from Indigenous North America. How We Go Home is an oral history collection that shares contemporary first-person stories in the long and ongoing fight to protect Native land, rights, and life. And today we're really thrilled to have 3 incredible speakers with us to talk more about How We Go Home and also share a larger conversation about contemporary Indigenous visibility and representation. So I'm really excited to introduce our 3 panelists. First, we have Sara Sinclair, who is the editor of How We Go Home. Sara is an oral historian, writer, and educator of Cree, Ojibwe, and settler descent. She teaches in the Oral History Master's Program at Columbia University. Sara has contributed to the Columbia Center for Oral History Research's COVID-19 Oral History Narrative and Memory Archive, the Obama Presidency Oral History, and the Robert Rauschenberg Oral History Project. She's conducted oral histories for the Whitney Museum of American Art, New York City Department of Environmental Protection, and the International Labor Organization, among others. Sara, we're really thrilled to have you here with us today. Thank you. Also with us today is Ashley Hemmers, who is a narrator in How We Go Home. Ashley is an enrolled member of the Fort Mojave Indian tribe, whose reservation, as she mentioned, spans the states of California, Arizona, and Nevada. After leaving the reservation for an undergraduate degree on the East Coast, Ashley returned and now works as a tribal administrator. She is a strategic specialist in multi-state cross-jurisdictional development and management of tribal economies, and she holds over 10 years of experience in tribal enterprising. During her time within tribal government, Ashley has worked to strengthen tribal and federal and tribal and state partnerships by developing strategic models of performance for service areas within the tribal organizational structure. Ashley graduated with her BA from Yale University and a graduate certificate in nonprofit management and Master's of Public Administration from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Ashley, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And finally, I'm really excited to introduce Terria Smith. Terria is the editor of News from Native California, a quarterly magazine devoted to the vibrant cultures, art, languages, histories, social justice movements, and stories of California's diverse Indian peoples. Terria is also the director of California Indian Publishing at Heyday. She's also a member of the Native American Journalists Association and alumna of the University of California, Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. So thank you so much to each of our 3 speakers for making the time to be here today and join us in this conversation. We're really excited to have you. I want to encourage folks tuning in both on Zoom and on YouTube. We will have a Q&A at the end of the panel, so please do ask questions and share comments in the chat box throughout the conversation, and we'll make time to answer some questions at the very end. So bringing it back to the book that we're celebrating today, How We Go Home. As we mentioned, How We Go Home is an oral history collection that shares stories of first-person stories in the long and ongoing fight to protect Native land, rights, and life. In the book, 12 Indigenous narrators, one of whom includes Ashley, share their stories that are shaped by loss, injustice, resilience, and the struggle to share space with settler nations. As Anissa mentioned, How We Go Home is the latest book in the series from Voice of Witness, Voice of Witness is a human rights oral history nonprofit based in San Francisco that works to amplify the voices of people impacted by injustice. Voice of Witness provided the oral history training, editorial guidance, and funding for the How We Go Home project. And the book was published just last month by Haymarket Books, which is an independent publishing house based in Chicago. And the book is currently available for purchase now on the Haymarket website, in case you're interested in buying a copy. This is an oral history book, again, which was released last month, and it's very accessible for readers of all backgrounds, including students of all ages. It's not like a dense academic book, it's very accessible. And Voice of Witness has also developed a free set of lesson plans for the book, which educators or students can now download directly for free from the Voice of Witness website. So I encourage you to check that out as well. Well, to start our conversation, I want to first talk to you, Sara. And again, Sara is the editor of How We Go Home. And I just want to ask you, why you chose oral history as the platform to share this project.
Sure. I came to New York City to attend a master's program in oral history. I've always, whenever I've wanted to learn something about a time or a people or a place, I've always turned to memoir or biography. That's always been the best way for me to absorb information. One person's individual account of a larger collective experience has always been my best teacher. And I love listening to people. I much prefer sitting and listening than speaking myself. There were many, many reasons that I was drawn to the field of oral history, but also being an Indigenous person myself, I grew up really aware of the fact that Indigenous representation was lacking, both in my own educational experience as a young person, but then just in the mainstream media and culture in both Canada, where I grew up, and the United States, where I was a student. So I came to this master's program with the idea that I would then use oral history to amplify different Indigenous voices in one way or another. And after I arrived in New York City, I had to pick a thesis project. And it's kind of a long story, but ultimately I ended up interviewing people like Ashley Hemmers, who had a very specific narrative arc, and that for at least that part of their life. And that was, had grown up in reservation communities in the United States specifically, had left to attend elite academic institutions, and then had moved home again to work for their nations. And so towards that thesis work, I was able to travel to a couple of different nations, one to Fort Mojave to meet with Ashley Hemmers, another narrator who's still in the book, his name's Weezy Little Elk. I traveled to Rosebud to meet with him. And the experiences that I had towards that thesis were just so rich and so immediately clear to me that there was this collection of voices that could come together with narrators like Ashley Hemmers, who are just such incredible educators. The way that Ashley was able to narrate her own life in this moment, but to narrate it within a much, much longer historical arc was incredible. And she wasn't the only one who could do that. Weezy also did that. And so I very quickly felt like their voices would create a really rich educational tool for North Americans, both Indigenous and not.
Yeah, and could you, for some people who might be, newer to oral history, could you explain like what it is, like what your role as the editor for an oral history collection, what that means?
Sure. Yeah, so after I graduated from Columbia, I had this, because I started very quickly to think that this was going to be a book, I actually asked my department if I could produce a thesis that was a book proposal in format. And I brought it to Voice of Witness, and Voice of Witness was interested. I think they were really interested in exploring the topic, but they wanted to make it a little bit more expansive so that we can include a greater range of life experiences. So what my role became with Voice of Witness was first coming up with a central guiding question for a collection on a topic that's pretty vast. Voice of Witness is interested in amplifying stories of injustice. And at that point, it's not like I was exploring stories within one particular nation. I was thinking, I want to do this. I want to start with broad strokes. So it was, okay, how do we focus a conversation or a series of conversations around amplifying voices or experiences of injustice in Native North America? That's a huge topic, right? So we came up with a guiding question, and that question was, what is it like to be a citizen of a nation within a larger nation whose fundamental economic, political, cultural, spiritual goals are so often at odds? And that was really helpful because it allowed me to pursue conversations with people with a great range of experiences and people from all across the continent. So the next step was identifying narrators. And that was partly because, as I said, the topic was so broad, we knew that we weren't going to be able to cover every issue facing contemporary Indigenous peoples. But there were also certain issues that we knew that we could not include. So that was kind of a helpful starting place. We knew that we had to address the legacy of the residential schools, boarding schools. We knew that we had to address the high rates of kids, Native kids in care today. We knew that we had to address issues of environmental injustice. We knew that we had to address high rates of incarceration. But also within that, I wanted to make sure that the people that we were choosing to speak with were not just illuminating these injustices, but they were also people, narrators, who could speak about what we're moving towards. So not just what we're moving away from, but also what we're resisting and how we're moving forward. So it was finding the right people to speak with. And then for about 2 years, I was so lucky and I got to go and travel and speak to people. So I traveled, the first trip that I took with Voice of Witness was to Winnipeg, which is where my own father is from. His nation is Peguis Nation, which is like a couple hours north of Winnipeg. So I wanted to start there. Then I went further west in Canada to Vancouver Island, to Tsartslip First Nation, Snemo First Nation, Northern British Columbia, back to the Southwest to Santa Clara Pueblo, back to the Dakotas, to Cheyenne River Indian Reservation, interviewed in New York City, interviewed at Six Nations in Ontario. So it was just this incredible education for myself to travel so widely and to speak to people with such a range of experiences. And then I would come back to Brooklyn and I would edit. And it was, ultimately it took about 2 years once we were like really in the thick of it to put together the 12 narratives.
Yeah, I know it was an incredible journey, and just hearing you describe all the different places you went to. I want to hold up, just in the book, if people have a copy of it, there's an incredible map of all the different places where the narrators are from and where Sara talked to folks. And it really is such a really broad collection of stories in terms of location, but they're also very connected by the different themes that you mentioned. Now that the book is, out in the world, what are some of your hopes for the project, Sara?
I often have, because we've been doing so many events, it's been such a nice opportunity to reflect on the experience, but also to reflect on like the real transitional moments for myself in the project. And one thing I've been telling people lately is that, Ashley was the first person that I traveled to interview. And I've said, I really don't know if this whole like line of work and life would have unfolded in the way that it did had she not been the first person that I met, because she's amazing, but more specifically, because she shared a story, and she should share it, but she's shared a story about being a young person and going to the library and that being this moment of impact for her. So maybe, if it's okay, Ashley could share the story and then I could say like my takeaway from that.
Yeah, Ashley, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I don't know, I really like libraries. And ever since I was young, I was fortunate enough to grow up with my grandmother, who I still care for to this day. And she kind of impressed on all of us the importance of reading. And for people who are like me, sometimes books are hard to come by. Newspapers are even harder to come by, and safe places even more so. So the Needles Public Library here in Needles, California, ended up becoming a second home for me after school. And it helped to kind of open up my mind to different things. And I got to learn a little bit about myself through those books. And I didn't know how important that would be continued to this day as kind of a continued learner in how I utilize research and libraries to kind of continue the work that I do. So, I mean, I love libraries.
One of the things that you talked about was how you discovered books about the Holocaust. Do you remember that?
Yeah, so I went through this, big phase. There's a lot of veterans in my area. A lot of people go serve. My family is an Army family. I have, a younger cousin who's enlisted now. We have a lot of veterans, and because of that, we have a lot of books in our library about wars, World War II. And I started reading, Anne Frank, and then different wars, different memoirs about that. And it started to become, I almost, when I was reading it, was like, what's going on here? Like, I recognize some of the things that are going on here, like some of the things that even she was saying, or, the historians were saying. And I didn't even know that people could make a living writing about other people and writing about history, and that was actually a thing. So learning more about that helped to kind of make me want to know more about, like, if this is a thing, do other people do this, and do they do it for Native Americans? And has anyone ever asked questions like these for Native Americans? And that really started my curiosity with learning more about what I do now in terms of, poverty studies, studies of systems, studies of government, to see kind of how those policies impact people and what those impacts might mean to kind of a culture. So.
Yeah. And jumping off of that, Ashley, you were talking about, growing up and going to the library and then seeing some of, like, cultural experiences reflected in these books about the Holocaust. Kind of jumping off of that, can you talk a little bit about the representation, or really, I guess, lack of representation of Indigenous people in your education? I know that you went to a public elementary school in California. So can you talk a little bit about that lack of representation in education and in school as you were growing up?
Yeah, I think, well, I'm a Southern California Indian. I'm Mojave, and California has a definitely, and hopefully Terria can talk a little bit about this too, an interesting history when it comes to representation in school systems for Indian peoples, specifically California Indian peoples. And so I'm very happy that my family, specifically my grandmother, made it a point to make sure that I was grounded and centered in knowing kind of who I am. And so because it wasn't accessed in school, she would take us to bird gatherings and powwows. And so I'm looking at the chat here, and everyone's hit with this pandemic, and my family likes to go to gatherings and stuff. So I'm so excited to be in a room full of people from like Haudenosaunee and Miwok and Kumi Island, because it helps me to feel that connection of being around people from an area where you can gather and be yourself and actually say, hey, I'm from Fort Mojave, and people may not know where that is exactly, but kind of know your reference and like, oh, they're tribal. Oh, okay, she's an Indian woman. Oh, okay, like where did you grow up? Those things are really important for, I think, children. And now in my town, we've definitely, I know that my tribal education office, led by just a really passionate director who's been doing this for over 20 years, has worked really hard with, locally with our school systems and our public library here to bridge opportunities so that children in my area can have more opportunities to share their culture, but also to have books like, hopefully this book as part of their curriculum when they're doing book reports, or, have someone to look for. Because when I was looking in those books, when I was like, okay, let me see what Indian history is, let's see who these people are, it was like tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. And I was like, oh man, like, it took a while for me to be okay with that, and to kind of find other voices that could be more relative to how I understand the world from our perspective.
Yeah. Thank you, Ashley. And, Sarah shared a bit about, meeting you and how that was so influential to, creating the How We Go Home project. And I want to hear what it was like, Sarah, why you decided to be part of the project as a narrator.
Really because of an old Indian tradition, actually. Sarah and I have a mutual friend, Rick Chavoya, who's really family to me, an uncle almost, became my uncle on the East Coast. And she had started a master's program in New York City, and he kind of approached me. He's like, "Hey, I know this woman. She's real good. She's real nice. Like, she needs to talk to some students." It's like, "No." And he was like, "Well, she needs to know people from an actual reservation who went to like a Ivy." "No, I don't know." "Well, just come over. We'll have food." So it really happened because, I was probably hungry, and we connected, but more so because of those interpersonal connections, like we were just talking about in terms of representation. Sometimes because our what I find anyway, because our communities are not as representative, we always have to do like a vetting process for who wants to actually talk to us and how they're going to use our story and what that story is going to say and how it might affect us in the future. Because even with me, even with some of the stories with this particular project, my life has, a definite arc, but some of those nuances could have real life ramifications for me if the person who was listening to my story wasn't as careful. And I think that that's hard for Indian people when they're asked to share their story, because we're still kind of living in it. So if we're living in it and we're being studied at the same time, those two things sometimes don't play well together. And so when I met Sarah and I learned about kind of her nature, and she was kind of, given the gold seal of approval by someone that I knew, then we started this project and this journey together.
Yeah, and that reminds me of something that we talked about previously, Ashley, where we were talking about, how storytelling and narrative can be pathways for healing and for resilience. That's certainly true, but sometimes you have to back up first and before you jump into that healing part. And you talked about backing up and thinking first about what is necessary to get to that point. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Like, people think of, storytelling as healing, but what actually needs to happen first before we can get to that part?
Yeah, I think that, I'm glad that this project actually looks at Native Americans who either are working to find a solution for a current problem in Indian country, or are in their own communities doing that work, because it kind of helps me feel a sense of, camaraderie with others who sometimes, like when I go back to like an alumni event or an event like this, it's easy for me to just kind of, just be Ashley, the researcher who just is curious about certain things, right? But when I go home, those things actually have meaning. Like, it's actually impacting people in a real way, breaking up families still. And there is no easy solution to degrading community. There is no easy solution to rebuilding community. And I feel sometimes, because there isn't an easy access point to Indigenous communities, because Indigenous communities are so busy trying to, rebuild themselves, that we do tend to talk a lot about healing at a higher level without understanding what that means and how that builds in the community itself. I hope, like, in the future, once things are cooler, everyone's kind of calmed down a bit, we can have a real discussion about healing. But I think right now, when we talk about healing, we have to know that we're not touching things that kind of need to be cared for. You know, just to kind of make it clear, the same woman who gave me the passion for public libraries and told me to go to school and made my breakfast and, you know, I spend the most time with. She's a survivor of internment camp from California, you know, and she's Mojave. She's also a survivor of residential school. And people don't understand that those are two different things. Internment camp and residential school, boarding school, those are two very different things. Termination policy, assimilation policy, the real ramifications for my family and how, you know, how we choose to interact and engage with each other. I'm so thankful that, you know, she found a way to have a different type of relationship with me and her grandchildren and her great grandchildren. But sometimes I see, you know, how those strains happen to her children. My mother in general, I mean, we're great, but you know, those hurts are still there. That path is still there because some existing policy decided to intervene.
Mhm. Ashley, thank you so much for sharing that. You know, I know there's so much more of your story in the book, but thank you for sharing those thoughts right now. I appreciate that. I want to turn to Terria to talk a little bit more. You know, we're talking about representation and visibility of Indigenous folks, and a current, you know, project that is definitely connected to that is Terria's work. And so, Terria, I wanted to ask you if you could share a little bit more about News from Native California and your work at Heyday.
Thank you. Well, the Berkeley Roundhouse program, which is the California Indian Publishing Program with Heyday, focuses specifically on tribes that are indigenous to California. And this is important work for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons that you talked about is about visibility. We in California, a lot of people call California home now, but this has been our home for a very, 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 very long time. And there's over 150 tribal nations in California, more than 100 federally recognized, and then more than 50 tribes that are unfortunately not recognized by the federal government. And a lot of times we have a hard time being seen because, you know, people, I talked to the artist, Kuya artist Gerald Clark, and he talks about how when people look at the Southwest, you know, they don't necessarily consider California in that as well. So they don't think of tribal people. They think of tribal people being somewhere far away, somewhere else, not in California. And so the work that we do supports California stories specifically. So News from Native California, which is a magazine that's published quarterly. Those are all California stories from California people about what's going on in their tribal communities. And the books that we publish are about California tribal people, by California tribal people, about their experiences. And that's important. And I find regularly that I have regular experiences about that importance. People say things like, well, where did all of you tribes come from? Or where, you know, like, oh, there's Native people in California. I tell this story that I've told when we had met before about a gentleman that had come to, you know, the Autry Museum, and he was kind of around when we were having our 30th anniversary for the magazine. And I come from a tribe of bird singing people, Cahuilla. I'm from Torres Martinez Reservation. And so we had singers there that were from Quechan and also from various Cahuilla tribes. It was an intertribal group that was there singing birds with rattles. And the gentleman asked afterwards, he said, "Why aren't you guys playing drums?" And he asked me, and I said, "Well, that's not what we do here. You know, that's our people don't do that." And he couldn't get past it. He talked to me for 15 minutes about you know, it was kind of like a insistence thing of, you know, Indians are supposed to play drums type of thing, you know, and it was finally I had to tell them, well, why don't you go talk to the singers? And, you know, the singers are all men. So, you know, you talk to them, ask them why they're not playing drums. But, so yeah, that visibility and representation for our, I mean, and this is our own home. It's a very, very strange and alienating feeling when, you know, people don't recognize you in our own home. I mean, you're in our place, and you know, and they don't see us. So yeah, I feel like that's the work that I do specifically, you know, to bring visibility and illuminate stories specifically from California.
Yeah, that's such a powerful anecdote about having the assumption, that very particular assumption of that one person who was insisting, talking about the drums. And something I know that you've mentioned to me also is the way that there are stories and images that capture joy and humor and love that is experienced by contemporary Indigenous folks. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that's you know, captured in the magazine and in the books.
The magazine, it's very challenging work to be able to try to provide representation for so many different tribal groups. And but we do the best that we can. And what helps is that it's a submission-based magazine, so people kind of come into us with and share their stories with us. So we're not so we don't have the complete responsibility of having to go out and try to tell everybody's stories, but people kind of come in and share what they're willing to share with us. And some of the times we have the opportunity to be able to build magazine issues around a theme. And some of the themes that we've chosen in the past have been around family, nature, and the environment. And we did an issue some years back that was focused on love. So and which was, you know, kind of obvious to me, because there's a lot of love in tribal communities, but people from outside of tribal communities, there's this kind of this image of you know, and none of those things are reflective of love, you know, like Ashley was talking about, like, you know, people think, oh, you know, Indians were so tragic, or we're so sad, or, you know, those sorts of things like that, but not necessarily that we love, you know, our families, and we love our communities, and we love, you know, so much about our culture and things like that. So we did a whole issue that centered around love, and that was a really, really fun issue to put together and everything, because it went, you know, all the way from, you know, people talking about how they met each other, California Native couples talking about how they met each other, from old stories. There was a gentleman who wrote a story, Louis Trevino, who's actually a Ohlone as well, from the San Francisco. She's from Carmel. His group is from Carmel, but he shared a wonderful story about an ancestor and she was a funny, older, spunky woman who, you know, used kind of provocative language and everything like that. And that was a fun story. But just to be able to share that, you know, another human side of us that the people don't really get to engage with, because, you know, they think that we're all about something else, but never love. And so that was a good project to be able to work on.
Yeah, I wanna ask Sara. I think, Sara, I heard you say recently that especially in Canada, when non-Indigenous folks are covering stories of Indigenous people, I think you said it's like the 3 or the 4 Ds. If you wouldn't mind, 4 Ds, would you mind sharing what those are? Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry, my Zoom game is poor today. There's this idea I'm sure it's equally true here, but the context that I shared was Canadian, that for Natives to be included in mainstream media, they have to be either dying, dancing, drumming, or drunk. And that's like the only way that things are going to get reported on. And so, yeah, similarly to what Terria was saying with the book, you know, my greatest avoidance was I never wanted this to be a collection of sad stories. That would have been the worst thing that this book could have been. And so almost everything that I did in terms of the research, in terms of the narrator selection, in terms of the interviewing, in terms of the editing. That was always front and center in my mind. Like, we do not need a collection of sad stories. We need all of those other things that Terria was just talking about, family and love and joyful moments and everyday living and all of those other elements that are just don't seem to be covered or of interest so often when settler media is covering Indigenous life. So that was a real driving force for me as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I definitely see that connecting so clearly to your work, Terria, and kind of working off of a comment that you mentioned, Terria, about people, not, thinking of California Native tribes as being far away, like geographically, as you just said. I often, it seems like people also think of Native tribes as being far away, like in the timeline too, like really in the past. And so I just want to ask you about, the fact that News from Native California, how many years has this publication been going on for? Like, it's really, it's so many years.
Yeah, we've been around for more than 30 years, close to 35 actually. And it's been, when it was initially started, it was started to kind of, in the 80s, it was started to kind of let people know what kind of events were going on in different type of tribal communities, and it just grew and grew and grew. And now it's, arts and cultures and social justice and history and all these other kind of things. It has to be so many things because it's the only publication that we have for this specific demographic of people, which actually it's a strange thing to say because we're just talking about a region, but really these are different tribal nations with really distinct different cultures and languages and all sorts of different things. It's for us, we can see the difference in a lot of ways. Like, for example, again, just for example of bird singing, like I can listen to bird song and hear if it's a Kauai song or if it's a song from the Colorado River tribal people or or a different place. But other people come to us and they can't hear the difference. They can't to them it might as well be the same song. So when I come up against those things, I realize how much work. I'm like, oh, I guess I'll always have a job because people need to learn a whole bunch. So
yeah, the learning is ongoing, and yeah, I think it's just so powerful that the magazine has been going on for so many years, and there's so many new issues like every year. Like, I believe you all just released. When was your latest issue released?
Our latest issue release was in October, and that was the fall 2020 issue.
Yeah, so very much, stories existing in the present. Yeah,
it's
and kind of, connect. Oh, go ahead, Julia.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to, kind of shift the conversation for all three of you, and we've been talking about representation and visibility, and I just want to talk more about those themes. About what does visibility of Indigenous people mean to each of you? Because it's probably something that has different definitions. And what are your hopes for that visibility? Looking ahead to the future. Something I would love to hear your thoughts on.
I guess we're not all going to talk at once. I'll break it. Visibility, I feel like, it has many different lanes for tribal people because there's so many different tribal people, right? And so even in my own tribe, I'll share two quick stories. Okay. So we all know what's going on with kind of, the national scene, but something interesting that happened during the course of the first week of this month was Arizona, right? And they talked a lot about Arizona's native vote and how that was, instrumental. And I talk about that because my tribe is in Arizona as well. And there was a pretty prominent kind of news station that called a group of the 6%ers something else. And when I think about like visibility and I think about how people look at us, they're sometimes I feel like they don't know what to do with us. So they're like, yeah, we can't write Indian, or we can't write this, or we can't write that, or and so the whoever put something else was kind of, a good capture of kind of their ideas of not being able to understand or acknowledge or have that conversation with what do we do in terms of visibility for this type of population. But for me, on the flip side, the fact that like my social media went crazy and started trending something else, and it was like this whole joke in Indian country, laughing and sharing and growing from this something else embodiment. When I think about visibility, that is the visibility that I really kind of tend to lean towards, because for all these years, you have this whole group of people in this really predominant news station who doesn't know how to categorize us. And here's this kind of group of indigenous folk who are like, well, whatever, we are something else. Like, this is what we are. This is how I'm something else. And I think that that's kind of something, a lesson that could really be learned from Indian country in terms of visibility, and that not everyone's going to want to acknowledge that you are there. So what does that mean? And unfortunately for Indian people, Indian children, especially, they have to learn really young how to find who they are then from the people either around them, or be pretty crafty with who they can become. So that's visibility for me. I don't know, Terria, if you have some more to comment with that.
I do. I do. I often when I give these talks, I talk about an interview that I did some years ago when I used to when I used to work in television. And it was a gentleman who was from one of the Kumeyaay bands in San Diego County. And I asked him about, because he was an alum of San Diego State University. So I asked him what that experience was like, in university. And he was very indignant about the fact that there were history teachers and instructors and that who didn't know anything about local tribal people in San Diego County, and that he had to, like, as a student, educate these teachers, and like, he's supposed to be there learning, and he's having to do the job of educating people. That's an unacceptable situation for me, and I'll tell you why. Because San Diego County has more reservations in it than any other county in the United States. And there's people that don't know anything about the tribal people there. And I can't accept that. Like, that's an unacceptable situation to me. I know personally, just because when I could travel before the pandemic and everything, I would orient myself, or I noticed that when I would think about where I was going, it was about the people that live there. Okay, you're going to San Diego, you're going to San Diego, that's where the Kumeyaay people are from. Or you're going to, San Francisco, that's where Ohlone people are from. Or you're going to, and I completely aware of that all the time. And the fact that people drive by tribal communities all the time through California and somehow don't know anything about tribal people besides maybe their economic ventures, like gaming facilities and things like that, it's very frustrating. And it's like, okay, at a certain point, maybe you're choosing not to see us. Maybe you're choosing not to acknowledge us. Why would you do that? Why would you not want to acknowledge that? Because then you have to start acknowledging other things, like the fact that you tried to wipe us off the face of the earth and that you're on stolen land type deal. So that's what I think about visibility and the reasons why, people choose not to acknowledge us a lot of times.
And it just feels like such a big gap meeting someone as an adult who lacks so much knowledge, right? And so like you were saying, the student who has to come into a space and act as an educator. And I think one thing that I've been thinking a lot about lately is how different the world could be if, you know, if education was different, right? Which was a big part of the reason that I was drawn to work with Voice of Witness in the first place, but even much younger kids, you know, like if all North Americans started reading books that actually had representation of Indigenous peoples to their 2 and 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, and then those kids just grew up with that, right? So, okay, now you're like a 6 to 8-year-old reader, like what are the appropriate materials for you to continue that learning? And now you're a youth, like what can you be reading now to continue that learning? So that you don't have a professor who doesn't have any of that information, right? The education has to start so much younger so that it's happening at an age appropriate stage, along with all the other learning that we have to do to live as part of a collective or in this society.
And I wonder if you could touch on, you know, having more representation, but also the representation of stories and narratives that are by Indigenous authors and narrators, and not just about, you know, Indigenous people. I don't know.
I mean, I
Sarah,
think
yeah.
like because oral history always thinks about the encounter, we're so conscious as a field of this idea that, you know, Ashley so there are like probably hundreds of versions of an 8,000 word document that attempts to narrate Ashley's life from birth to now, right? And so had Terria done the interview, had you done the interview, had anybody else done the interview, the result of that encounter would have been something very different, right? And I think that's especially true when you're talking about people that don't come in with the same maybe background, the same like awareness about the issues that need to be addressed, the same like sense of the kinds of protocols like Ashley was describing. You know, part of the reason she trusted me was because there was a friend in common, right? So all those different things that we share help us to have a kind of conversation that I don't think she would have had with a non-Indigenous interviewer.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I think about the by and about question in an oral history context.
Mm-hmm.
Or it would still have to be surface, right? Because if you don't know that, you know, if you're coming to talk to an individual like me and you say, oh, well, you're Native American, and you don't know that my people are bird singers and dancers, and that we're not Kauai, but we are Mojave, and the difference in the nuances between a Kumeyaay and a desert Kauai and a mountain Kauai, then and a Wallapai and a Colorado River and a Catan and a Kokopah, then you're already not able to have that conversation because you're not ready. And it's not our jobs to make others ready to engage with our culture. Our culture is here. Our people are here. We're from here. And so that's just like so unusual to me when someone's like, oh yeah, can I pick your brain about, you know, Native American issues? I'm like, sure, what about them? And they're like, oh, well, you know, this and this and this, and it's so high level. And I'm like, okay, like, why do you want to talk to me about buffalo? I don't even eat buffalo. I don't know. Like, I can refer you to someone where that is very sacred to them, and or they enjoy it. I don't even know what I would do if I saw a buffalo. I'd probably run. I'm not sure. So I think that it's very interesting that people often want to come to an Indian home and have a conversation, but not only just come to our homes, but walk in and say, hey, why is your couch there? And why do you have that couch? And why are you sitting on that? It's just so bizarre. And when people start really thinking about that, then they can start to understand the places they put Indian people in when they have these questions. That's why we laugh so much, because we have to, otherwise we'd be all crazy.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of connecting to that, the concept of ethical storytelling. I think that's very related to what we were both saying, Sarah and Ashley. I was wondering if, especially Terria with the magazine, if you could talk more about like, what is ethical storytelling? How does that show up in your work?
Oh gosh, that's a That's a very, very interesting topic. Because even today, well, I think that well, a lot of people come to the Roundhouse program specifically, and with ideas that they have, you know, for books that they'd like to publish about Native people, and they themselves a lot of times are not Native people. And so, and this happens too with submissions to the magazine as well. People will come and they'll have this story all about a particular tribal group, and they have not talked to a single person from that tribal group at all. And I don't understand. I feel, to me, I feel like that approach is extremely antiquated, for one. You know, I feel like, okay, you know, there are so many California Native scholars, you know, that have been, you know, designated by the hard work that they've done in the institutions to become scholars. And, you know, so, you know, they're Native people and they're scholars, so they should be legit both ways. And you haven't talked to any of these folks. And then the response that a lot of people give when I direct them to do so, it's almost like I'm asking for something that's unreasonable. And I'm thinking, well, there's plenty of Native people that you could talk to, and you didn't talk to anybody. Like, that's not what this department and this publication is for. And so that, to me, is unethical. If you want to talk about, you know, you're going to continue to other people. I feel like there's a certain amount, but a lot of people don't, they don't even consider it. Like, oh no, there's all this research and all this stuff, you know, why would I need to talk to an actual Native person about this? Well, there's a lot of reasons. And so I feel like, you know, that becomes a question of ethics to me.
Yeah, totally. And Sarah and Ashley, did you want to respond to that also about how the ethics come up in your work?
I mean, in terms of ethics for us, I think that identifying who's writing the piece or who is providing the art or where it's actually coming from is very important. And, you know, it can be very tricky in Indian communities because there's differences between federal recognition, state recognition, non-recognized. Blood quantum is heavy in California Indian communities. You know, that's a whole other discussion that people, you know, just don't want to talk about in terms of how, and we're seeing it in real time here in my reservation, where this idea of designating Indian people as of other is actually separating families, where now we are put in a position as Indian people to have to say, no, your granddaughter can't be, you know, a part of the tribe, or no, your grandson can't be. And you're like, wait, how does this even work? Has anyone had a discussion about this? Like, who was there and said yes to any of this stuff? Because it's not affecting whoever made it, it's affecting us. And that's the same with kind of the ethics around it. Is a lot of things have happened to Indian communities without our participation. And so if you are interested in kind of writing and, you know, participating in Indian scholarship, Native American scholarship, then having a centered awareness around that for you will open up doors for you more than you would even be ready to know, because you'll be able to understand these pathways and how it's affected Indian cultures, how it's affected Indian people, and how it continues to affect actual lives. And that's the difference between, you know, studying kind of our groups of our people, is that we're still going through these histories that we had no control over, saying we don't want it. You know, like I'm the administrator of my tribe, and I have yet to have one federal employee come and say to me, let's have a conversation about blood quantum and how is that working for you guys. Not once. And they're not going to. And so understanding those things and how realistic they are for our community, and that other people are trying to write about our community and may have, you know, some connection, just being aware would be so much more helpful. And there's like lists, like people do great work. Terria does great work about highlighting some of those artists and researchers, libraries are a great source. You know, there are definitely lists out there where you can become informed and empowered.
Yeah. Think of that phrase, nothing about us without us. Yeah. Sarah, did you want to respond also?
Yeah, I can just respond simply. I mean, I think for me, when I think about ethical practice, it's as an oral historian, it's really about helping people to tell the story, the story that they want to tell, the story that they want to tell about themselves for the reasons that they want to share it. So it's about, not coming in with my own agenda, or my own sense of, what the story might be, could be, should be, but really like coming into a kind of partnership with a narrator. And it almost like it's like about emptying out my own kind of any sort of sense of outcome that I have, to just listen and follow the clues that the narrator is laying down for me, so that I can act as a guide or a mirror for them to share their story in hopefully the richest possible way. And then as a second step, hopefully that there's some kind of reciprocity, that they feel like there was a good reason that they shared that story, that we're going to put it to good work in some way.
Thank you, Sarah. And I know we're running a little, we're almost at time, but I do want to leave a couple minutes to talk, to answer questions. And so please continue to ask questions in the chat if you haven't already. One question that I want to pose to the group, which is from Eileen, is what do you believe is the role of storytelling and solidarity for folks who have lost all connection to and record of their Indigenous culture due to colonization and colonialism, especially if their ancestry is outside of the so-called United States?
You know, I'll share a personal experience with that, if I can. But for me, my grandmother is one of 7 fluent speakers of the Fort Mojave Indian language left on my reservation, all over the age of, I want to say 79 now is the youngest, last fluent speaker, meaning that they grew up in a Mojave home and they spoke Mojave through and through. And when I think about storytelling and the solidarity, I think that it's important that we share stories like this. Even though I was kind of hesitant, our good friend kind of talked to me a little bit about that. And if we didn't have people in our community who were brave enough to share our language and our songs, we might not have them. And that's how important oral histories can be to Indian people. And I would just suggest, my narrative talks a lot about libraries, because I've definitely found a solace in libraries, like from the time I was home to the time that I went to college and grad school. And there's a lot of hidden history in there. And I would just suggest, being open to that, asking questions, and finding your own path to some linkages that may be helpful for you. I know that they're helpful for me. Hearing old voices and hearing old songs and just kind of, it was funny. The story I was going to share is that a university in California has a couple of reels of older Mojaves kind of talking around, and they had like language studies. And it was funny because the oral historian that was taking it, didn't realize that the 2 Mojaves, one being my uncle, were joking about the historian. And so when I was listening to it, I was like, oh my God, did he just say that? Like, and they were like, yeah, this guy, he wants to talk to his this again? How long do you think he's going to be here? And, what's going to happen? Okay, well, let's just talk about this because we have to go here. And finding those pieces kind of made me feel more connected, because I was like, oh man, like even then, like they were doing what they had to do because they thought it was important or for whatever reason, but they were still being themselves. And I thought that it was so important to have that for me, because it made me really understand that even though I have so much going on around me and the work that I do and the stuff that's afflicting my people, that I can still be myself. I can still, be on Instagram or, go for a walk, and it'll still be okay.
I love that story, Ashley. One last question I want to ask, I know we're running out of time, is it's kind of a big question, but how can we begin to decolonize our arts, historical, and literary curriculums? Kind of a big question.
Okay, I'm gonna try this out. I have a really, really, really difficult time with the concept of decolonizing institutions that weren't intended for us in the first place. And it's a really, I mean, I can say for me that education has enriched my life in a lot of ways, but that has not been the experience for a whole lot of people throughout the generations. Um, People have a hard time trusting educational institutions because the detriment that they've caused to our tribal communities, things that or institutions that were stolen from our communities, the way that children were taken away to facilities where they lost everything, from language to culture to the concept of family and being able to raise your own children. That was busted up in the name of education. So to decolonize a structure like that, to me is, I don't even know where you would start with something like that. So when people talk about decolonizing these institutions, I'm like, what does that even look like? What does that even, what would that be like? Would that be like us having our own educational systems, not participating? I have to say, a lot of the area that I come from, I've found that some of our strongest leaders were people that were initially educated out of tribal schools, tribal colleges and universities and everything, things where people got to learn about themselves and their own histories, and that were governed by the tribes themselves. And so I sincerely apologize if I can't get into the answer of decolonizing educational institutions, but it's a hugely complicated subject, at least in my perspective.
I just want to add to that. I kind of see someone in the chat talk a little bit about sovereignty, and this kind of came up in another event in terms of decolonization. I don't know, maybe it's a California Indian thing, who knows? But for me, decolonization is so problematic because the system wasn't made for me, it was made against me. And for someone who said that it can't, then I can show you proof of where it is, including myself and my family. And my family, we could actually have dinner, like we in real life. But sovereignty is something that not a lot of people want to point to. And what does that mean? How can you be, when we talk about decolonization, we're not really talking about, doing something active for that Indian community. When we talk about sovereignty, you talk about rights, you talk about freedoms, you talk about being, and those conversations are more important, I find, to myself and people within my community, and how we can maintain a semblance of sovereignty to be able to be ourselves in a system or a surrounding system that continues to permeate our lives.
Sarah, did you want to respond also to that question? Yeah, I think,
I can add to what they've both shared.
yeah. Well, I know that we're a little over time actually, but I wanted to ask our speakers if there's any last words that they want to share with our audience who's listening before we close.
Well, I just want to say thank you everyone for joining us and listening to us for this hour. I really appreciate it. And I was really excited to see all the questions. So thank you for spending some time with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Ashley and Terria, for being part of this event today. And Ella for moderating.
Thank you so much as well for inviting me to be a part of this. We're just so everyone knows, we're featuring a review of this wonderful book project in the forthcoming issue of the magazine. So we're really excited about that. Thank you so much for Ella and Voice of Witness and the San Francisco Public Library for allowing me to be a part of this. I appreciate it.
Thank you to our three amazing speakers, Ashley, Terria, and Sara. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you everyone who's been watching and engaging and asking questions. If we didn't have time to get to your question, I'm going to put my email in the chat so you can email me and I can kind of field some questions potentially to our speakers. And so I can definitely respond to that. But again, thanks everyone for tuning in. If you're interested in, getting the book, How We Go Home, you can find it at Haymarket Books. You can also find our curriculum at voiceofwitness.org. But thank you all so much again. Very big thanks to the library and to Anissa for hosting this event. I think the love for libraries is very clear throughout this conversation. We all love our library. So thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.